Hello again everyone, it is Brian and we're back with yet another Fusion 360 tutorial. Today we are covering the sweep. Yes, the sweep. This is a new process. We've done extrudes, we've done revolves, and now we're moving on to sweeps. The cool thing about sweeps is they can create incredibly complicated geometry actually really simply. So the example we're going to use today is this lovely paperclip. I think this is actually a pretty fun example to use because it is a relatively complicated geometry to model, but it happens very, very quickly when we use the sweep. So the most complicated thing actually about this is going to be putting the dimensions on the sketch. Everything else about this is pretty easy. And if we look down here at my timeline, essentially there is a sketch for the path that we're going to follow. There is a sketch for the profile that we're going to extrude along the path, and then there's the sweep itself. So let me explain those two things. So in order to use a sweep, we need a path. And so think about that as like a road. And then we need a profile, and so think about that as a car on the road. And so wherever the road goes, the car will follow, and the car will continue driving in the same direction down the road. So in this case, our path or our road is the shape of the paperclip, if you follow my mouse all the way around here. And the car itself is going to be just this circle. And so I often talk about this as the cross-sectional geometry of our object. So the cross-sectional geometry of a paperclip is pretty simple. It's just a circle because it's made out of a piece of wire. And that wire is round, or almost always round in profile or cross-sectional geometry. So, so our first sketch is the road or the path, and the second sketch is the cross-sectional geometry, or in this case, a circle. So let's look at the dimensions. I have added a JPEG image of this sketch profile. It was just easier to grab a JPEG of the sketch than it was to do a full drawing, because the drawing doesn't really highlight a whole lot. So if I go here and I edit my sketch, just to kind of show the dimensions, we start at our origin point, and this is going to be really critical here because that origin point needs to be common for both the profile, i.e. the circle, and the path, i.e. this sketch. So we start here at the origin. It's going to be one line command. I'm going to use that that tangent arc as part of the line command. So remember, we just kind of like click and hold. I'll walk you through it as we do the sketch. But this will all be one line command to create this. And then we will just start to add dimensions in. And the order of the dimensions is pretty critical. If you start on the big ones, you'll invert your geometry. So don't start there, start small. And the tricky thing about dimensions is Fusion does not like to dimension to like the midpoint of this arc to this point. It doesn't like to hold that midpoint on the arc. So we actually have to draw these, and you can kind of see it behind the dimension line, these construction lines. If I hover over this, you can see the blue dashed line behind it. They are providing us a lock that allows me to dimension between things. So that's actually the most complicated thing of this whole process. All right, so let's get started. Again, it's going to be pretty easy, I think, for us to draw this. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a new design in Fusion so we can start from scratch and we can all do this together. Hopefully y'all remember the dimensions as we go. So let's go from the beginning. So like everything else in Fusion, we are going to start with a sketch. So I'm going to click the Create Sketch button. I want my paperclip to sit on the ground in its normal position, so I'm going to choose the top plane as my path plane, and then I'm going to start by invoking the line command. So I can just hit L, or I can invoke the line command here. And again, the origin point is really critical, so I'm going to make sure I click on that origin point to start, and I'm going to start to pull a line out from this. My whole paperclip was about 30 millimeters in length, so not to get too crazy, I'm going to make this line a little bit less than that because I know it's going to be this is the first baseline of that paperclip. So I click to position that about 25 millimeters out, and go ahead and zoom in a little bit so we're a little bit closer here. And then remember, if I come back to that point that I clicked on and click and hold, I'm going to pull out and up and over. And what you want to do is watch when so see how when my crosshairs come over that original point, it kind of like snaps there. This is going to help me create a tangent arc onto the second line. And if you like let go here, which is fine, we'll have to add those tangencies in. So I'm purposely not going to let it snap there, just so I can show you how to add those tangencies in on this first one. But ideally, you'd move your crosshairs over until you see it snap directly above that point where you were at. But I'm going to put this one a little bit off so I can show you the difference. So I'm going to let go, and once I let go, it allows that line command to be continuous. I'm going to go past that first start point here. I'm going to go past that. Make sure that that line is horizontal. In this case, it's showing me parallel to that first line. That's fine. Click to position the end of that line, and then I'm going to click and hold and pull out and around to create that second part of the paperclip. Now this time I am going to let it sit there and snap. Once it snaps, I'm going to let go. Bring my mouse over past this arc point, so over here. Again, make sure that you see that horizontal or that parallel light blue double lines there showing me that it's parallel to the one above it. Click to end that line. Click and hold to drag out another arc. Again, I'm going to let it snap directly above there. I'm going to come above that line, let go, and then I'm going to come over here. I'm going to not click, but I'm going to hover over this start point and pull away so I see that dash line, follow it, and click to end that line. Once I'm there, I'm going to go ahead and hit escape. All right. So really quickly, let's just examine what we have. We have this coincident relationship of the start of our line with the origin point. That's fine. That was pretty basic because we started on that line. We have this flat line. It's showing us that that flat line is horizontal with this indicator here. We have this tangency that happens between this arc and this line. That's good. This line comes up. We don't have that tangency here, right? We want a tangent at each one of those points. And so this one, if you remember, I didn't let those crosshairs snap, and so it didn't create the tangency. So I need to go in and create that tangency now. To do that, I'm going to click the arc, I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to click this straight line, come up here to my Constraints tab, and I'm going to click Tangent. And that's going to add that tangency back in, and it fixes that. We want to do that before we do anything else, because that's going to be a primary constraint. Okay, now we have this line. You'll see that that line is going to be, whoops, I'm going to hit escape to get out of that. If you see, if I hover over the constraint line here, it's showing, it's highlighting this line and this line. So it's showing me that this line is parallel to this line is horizontal, so I know this line is horizontal. That arc, again, we have this tangency here, we have this tangency here, tangency here, tangency here, and we have these parallels that happen all through this, right? So good, we have all of that set up, and that locks in all the constraints we need, -1, which we'll get to at the very end here. But that's pretty much all the constraints we need, and now we need to go ahead and add dimensions. So again, I mentioned we're going to start small. So I'm going to go back here to my paperclip. I'm going to go back and I'm going to edit that sketch so I can look at some of these values. And by starting small, I mean I'm going to start with the smallest dimensions first. So this dimension that I have between this line and this line, which is 1.5, that's going to be my first dimension. The next one I'm going to do is this one that's between here and here. You'll notice, and I'll explain this in just a second, this has fx colon 1.5. That I've locked these two dimensions together because in every formula of my paperclip, I always want these distances between these two lines to be the same. So if I decide to change that to 2, I want this to also be 2. I'll explain how we do that in just a second. So I start with those. I'm going to move then to this spacing between this end point of the arc and this end point of the arc. Then I'm going to maybe add in this dimension of 3.5 for the radius of this guy. We'll probably add in this 10 here, between here and here, and then lastly we'll give it the overall dimension of the whole paperclip. So that's our order, and that's what I mean. We're going to start small and work our way larger. If we put in this 32 to begin with, it would probably take this arc and invert it, and on this particular geometry, it's really hard to uninvert that. So practicing that small to large dimensioning is a really good process. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Back here in my, my new file, I'm going to add my sketch dimension, so I either type D or hit the sketch dimension button. I'm going to click this line and I'm going to click this line, and that's going to create that dimension between them. So I'm going to click to position that dimension, and I want this to be 1.5 millimeters to lock that in place. Now what I want you to do is hover over that dimension for a second, and you'll see it says D1 colon 1.5, and so that is Fusion telling you that the first dimension D1 that is locked to 1.5. So you can always reference a value from another dimension by simply typing the dimension number. So you can either do this mathematically, so you can decide, like, if something is dimension 1 divided by 2, you can literally say D1 divided by 2, and Fusion will do the math based on whatever value you've input for D1. In this case, I just want this distance here to be the same as that distance there. So I'm going to click this line, I'm going to click that line, I'm going to click to position this, but now instead of typing 1.5, I'm simply going to type D1. When I do that, that locks this into place. And so if I hit escape for a second to get out of the dimension tool, and I double click this, and I make it 2, you'll notice that they're both now 2. It's locked it together moving forward. So I'm going to go back and change that to 1.5, and it follows. Okay. Now, the next dimension I said I probably wanted to do was the distance from this point to this point, the midpoint of this arc to the midpoint of this arc. And I said at the start of this, Fusion does not like to lock dimensions to the midpoint. So what we have to do is we actually, annoyingly, have to create construction lines at that stage. I can't dimension from the center points because that's not the dimension I'm given. The dimension I'm given is the dimension from here to here. It's not the distance between the center points. So that's the center point of this arc. This is the center point of that arc. They are not 4 apart. I don't know, let's see. This is gonna over constrain it for a second, but let's see what that is. That's 2.5, right? So that's a different measurement. And that's not the measurement we want. We want the measurement of 4. So to do this, we're actually going to draw all 3 of our construction lines at the same time. So I'm going to go to my line command, come over here, I'm going to find the midpoint. So if I just hover with that X, it'll eventually snap to the midpoint. You can also force it to the midpoint by holding down Shift. But I'm going to do that, and I'm going to pull away a vertical line. Hit Escape. I'm going to do the same thing, so you can type L again, or you can go grab the line tool. Again, I'm going to draw another line here, hit Escape, and one more. Type L for line, come over here to the midpoint of this arc, and create that line. So you notice this guy here is locked vertical, this guy here is locked vertical, this guy here is locked perpendicular to that line, which also is vertical. That's kind of an anomalous constraint. I don't really want this line necessarily constrained to this, although in this case it works fine. But just to force it to do what I want it to do, I'm going to go ahead and delete that constraint. So I'm going to click on that and hit the delete key, not the backspace, but the delete key. And then I'm going to click on that line, and then I'm going to click on the horizontal constraint. And you'll see now that adds that. It's kind of hidden behind the tangency, but it's that vertical constraint. All right. Second thing I want to do now that I have those lines there, I want to tell Fusion, ignore those lines. They're not part of my geometry. So I'm going to click that one, hold down Shift, click this one, keep Shift held down, click the third one, come over here to my sketch palette, tell it those are construction lines. It will turn those dotted. Now it's going to ignore that as actually part of your geometry. Now we are set to go with that dimension. I know that was a weird step that we had to do. It's just one of those funny things you have to do with Fusion. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to dimension between these two lines, and I'm going to make that 4. Now I can dimension this outside radius, which is going to be 3.5. Now I'm going to dimension from the origin point to this construction line on the left. That is going to be 10. And then I'm going to dimension from this construction line to this construction line to make the full width of my paperclip. All right, so that locks in all of the dimensions I need. Now, if you are paying attention, you will notice that there are a couple things that are not fully constrained. 3 of them I'm not worried about. 1 of them I absolutely am. So the 3 I'm not worried about are 1, 2, 3, these open circles here. They are not constrained, but they are also just construction lines. So I don't care really the length of those. There is one more point, however, that is not constrained, that needs to be, and that's this one right here. And if no tools are active, which they're not, if I grab this line, you'll see that I can pull that left and right. I can't pull it up and down because that line is locked parallel, but I can pull it left and right. And that's problematic. I want that point to be in line with that point. I could do that one of 2 ways. I could either say, okay, this is 10 units from here to here. I could create another dimension from this point to that line and make it 10. Or I could even say, like, if I hover over this, that's D5. So I could make that D5. That equals D5. So if that becomes 12, that would become 12. That's fine. You could add that dimension. There's actually an easier way to do this that doesn't include any dimensioning, and that is to apply a constraint. And so what I want to do is I want to highlight that point. I want to hold down Shift, and I want to highlight that point. And it's these 2 points that I want to be in line with one another, and so I can add a constraint between them to lock those in place. And so the constraint I'm going to use is the vertical constraint. So I click on horizontal vertical, you'll see that it creates that verticality between these 2 points. It now turns that dot solid black. If I hit escape, I can't move that dot. This is now a fully defined sketch. So that's our goal with that. And we're going to go ahead and finish the sketch. So there's the path. Now I need to create the profile that I want to extrude along the path. And again, that's the cross-sectional geometry of the paperclip, which in this case happens to be a circle. So interestingly, typically when we do a sketch, we then create a feature from that sketch. In this case, we're just going to do a second sketch. We need 2 sketches in order to create this geometry. So now I'm going to go back here to create sketch, and this time I'm going to choose the plane that is perpendicular to my path, and that is going to happen to be this right hand plane here. So I'm going to select that right hand plane. I'm going to hold down my Shift and just orbit a little bit out of plane so we can see what's going on here. Zoom in so you can see where I am on my paperclip. This is a very, very simple sketch. I'm going to create a circle. Center point of my circle is going to be the origin point. Again, it's very important. It shares that same point as the start of your path. Create that circle. Click the dimension tool. I'm going to add a dimension of 1 millimeter here. You'll notice now once I do that, that's black. It's fully defined. So we're good to go. I can finish the sketch. That was a really simple sketch, right? All right. So now we're going to come back here. I'm orbiting a little bit out of plane, and we're ready to actually create our sweep. So I'm going to go to the Create menu. I'm going to go down here to Sweep. So we've done Extrude, we've done Revolve, Sweep. Yeah, you can probably guess what our next lesson is going to be on. So we're going to go to Sweep. Type. This is going to be a single path. You can look, there's a couple options. You can add a path and a guide rail. You can add a path and a guide surface. I'm not going to cover those, at least in these early stage tutorials. There may be one that follows on that starts to make these a little bit more interesting. The path and guide rail is totally cool. You can make a trumpet essentially with one single sweep just by making the guide rail kind of get larger and pulling that geometry out larger. But in this case, we're doing a single path. Profile, it's asking me to select. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to select the inside of that circle. Path, where it's white, I'm going to click to make it blue. which doesn't allow me to select the profile. Click on anywhere on my path, and it's going to go ahead and create my profile. You don't want to worry about any of these other things. Orientation, that means that it's taking this profile and it's maintaining it perpendicular to the path. So when it gets to this curve, it's keeping that profile perpendicular all the way around. You could change that so it stays parallel, and this is going to be a self-intersecting geometry, and that's why it failed, right? Yeah, sweep would intersect itself. So that's why it won't work. But that would keep this parallel in this direction as it went around, and here it would just be infinitely thin, and so it would break down, and that's why we have to stick to the perpendicular option. And then we click OK. FYI, under operation, you can cut this out of something. So if you had a solid block and you wanted to make a profile inside the block that was shaped like a paperclip, you could just do this inside and then cut it from the body instead of creating a new body. But in this case, this is the only geometry we're going to have. And there we have it, this lovely paperclip, right? Pretty exciting, fairly straightforward, a pretty easy process to create a very, very complicated geometry. So I hope you found that helpful, and that's it for this tutorial. Tune in for the next one, and we'll continue our Fusion 360 lessons. Thanks so much for checking in. I'll see you later.